record, and then we can go ahead and get started.
All righty. So I'm Paula. I'm the Pediatric Track Director, and I have the privilege of introducing Alexa Manrriquez, who is our current Pediatric Track Fellow and has been such a wonderful addition to our team. So Alexa came from CHLA, where she did her residency as well as her executive year, and then joined us in fellowship. She has focused a lot over the years on equity, particularly related to kind of URM medical students and residents, and just really supporting those areas and mentorship. And you can really see how she brings all of that to patients and families. She does an incredible job really meeting families where they're at and then supporting collaboration between all the teams and the patients and families. And we just feel so lucky to have her with us this year, learning from her and getting to see how she's just growing over the years and all the wonderful things she's going to do. She will truly be a leader in this field. Alexa has a specific interest in hospice, which I think is part of the reason that drives her to this topic that she's going to share about today. And she also is somebody that just really likes to learn about things that she's interested in and she feels she doesn't know as much about. So I'm excited to introduce Alexa, and I think you guys will all just really love the talk that she has to share with us today. So Alexa, take it away.
Thank you, Paula. I'm extra grateful to Paula who, in guiding me and preparing for this grand rounds, really just enabled me to, she said, just pick something you find interesting and you're curious about and read about it and present it. So that's what I've done. So really, this talk, I feel like, is just me bringing you along in my own exploration of death and how people think about death and what do people do around the time of death of a loved one. And I have just felt sort of like, despite being in medicine, I've just sort of felt like death is a little bit of a black box. We're a bit removed from it, even in the world of medicine. And so I wanted to explore this. I also just wanted to recognize that, truly just scratching the surface here, but really am hopeful that some of the things I learned in this talk and perhaps some of the things that I'm sharing are really come back to how can we best serve our patients, knowing really that every person comes from a different place, a different perspective, different culture, worldview, and how all of those things are really intimately connected to how we sort of approach our own healthcare and decision making. So it felt sort of like a highly consequential topic for me, and I'm hopeful that you all will come along on the ride with me. I would totally love and appreciate, because I am definitely a student of this work. If you have perspectives, experience, corrections, really anything, please feel free to hop in, unmute, or write in the chat. And maybe, Paula, if people write in the chat, can you flag me? Okay, thank you. Okay, let's see. Okay, this is just briefly where we're going today. So here I just wanted to make sure I touched on the fact that we're sort of going all these places, and really though in the reading and research I did for this talk, it became pretty clear that the existing body of literature around death and death ritual and sort of grief and mourning from various perspectives, most of the body of literature is done by kind of one demographic of researcher, mostly white, mostly European, or from the US. So notably not a lot of voices of color in this work. And I think that's just important to think about as we move through the talk and as we think about sort of all of these concepts, wanting to keep this at top of mind. Especially, there are a couple of generalizations or frameworks sort of throughout the talk that I just want to make sure we're mindful of where they come from. And obviously we all know that every individual lives at the intersection of all their identities. And so we'll just remember that. Okay, just to start with a zoomed out view, all of us know that death is universal. It touches everybody's life, really, no matter who you are. But death, you might think that when you say somebody has died, you're on the same page with the person that you're talking to. And that may not be the case. Like, how we think about and conceptualize death and dying is really different. And again, informed by sort of all of our identities and lived experiences. I just read a couple of analogies that felt kind of interesting. So there's a public health researcher from UCLA who talks about death similar to weaving. So while a universal technique, or sort of like a universal thing, something that a lot of people do around the world, often with the same materials, there are different patterns, different styles, different techniques, depending on sort of who you are and where you're from and how you've learned. And so perhaps that is one way to think about death, as one of many ways of weaving. And then there's a social psychologist who likens it to the concept of eating. So you might think, when you're talking to somebody and saying, I'm going to have a meal, that they're totally on the same page with you about what that means. But eating, there are so many ways to do it. Like, what are you eating? How is the table set? Who is invited to the table? So much variety in how we think about eating and how we think about death. So, again, our perspective of death is really informed by so many things, and it then informs sort of our lifestyle, our readiness to die, all of our feelings around death, and sort of the ways in which we grieve and mourn. So I wanted to just, of course, not at all comprehensive, but just share perhaps some of the more common ways that death might be conceptualized by people in the world. So there is thought to be, for a circular nature, a circular pattern of life and death. So somebody might die and then be reborn into a new identity, and that can happen several times. I think this one is sort of most well known in relation to Hinduism, but there are many communities who view life and death in this way. Similarly, Final Destination, I think, thinks about physical death as occurring one time, and then a spirit will continue on to an ultimate or final destination. Most commonly, I think, certainly in the area that we practice, attributed to Christianity or thought of in relation to Christianity, but again, many communities subscribe. Coexistence and continuum of ancestors, I think, are sort of two sides of one coin, or two things on a similar spectrum, but basically where death is thought of as people who have died and people who are alive are still in coexistence with one another and can very much influence each other in a number of ways. And similarly, for a continuum of ancestors, there are, in many languages, only one word to describe elders and ancestors, so without differentiation to who is alive and who is not alive. Elders and ancestors sort of are referred to by one term and sort of accessed in the same way for help and support and things like that. I like that one because it kind of nicely demonstrates how our philosophies of life and philosophies of death are in relationship with other aspects of our life, including our language. Permanent disengagement. So some see death as really just an abrupt, right now transition. And after death, there is permanent disengagement from the world. And then there's the idea of multiple deaths, in which somebody might be thought to have died a number of times throughout their experience. So life might be thought to leave a body while somebody is sleeping or while they're really seriously ill. And I thought that one was important to mention because it really doesn't align well with the Western medical model. And so I see that sort of as a space where conflict or struggle could arise in any of our practices. So sort of thinking about how those and the many other ways of conceptualizing death might then sort of influence our own personal relationship with death, and sort of how that's colored and informed how we view death ourselves. So in my reading of sort of personal relationships with death, or sort of how people personally experience feelings and thoughts and stressors and worries around death, I came across a decent amount of literature around death anxiety, and I found it really interesting. So just to say, like, labeling as death anxiety might imply like something pathological. I think some level of death anxiety is quite natural in a lot of people. And also, as we'll talk about in another slide, could be really consequential if not addressed in somebody who is actively dying or nearing the end of life. So death anxiety can include a lot of things, but sort of fears and worries about, like, the dying process. Will dying be painful? Where will I go after I die? Who will suffer after I die? Will my family be okay? You might worry about other people dying. Like, I can't imagine being separated from my partner or my child, or whoever it is in your life that is important, or just sort of thinking and having stress about death in general. Like, why might death feel so cruel or feel so unfair? And those are all things that can, that sort of death anxiety includes. It might manifest in a number of ways. This is just 5 examples, but you might be somebody who, like, avoids funerals or avoids the hospital, visiting loved ones in the hospital when they're seriously ill. You might be somebody who is like really into extreme sports or like skydiving, and that might be one way of confronting your anxiety around death. One that sort of piqued my own interest, sort of personally, is the 4th one. So pursuing work that deals with death and dying. Just sort of had me pause and reflect on, of course, the fellowship I've pursued and what that might mean about my own relationship to death, my own feelings about death. Death anxiety can be influenced by a number of things, and we'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. But of course, like cultural, religious, societal background, lived experience with death previously, so personal experience, and then also things out of a patient's control and sort of within the scope of perhaps the medical team. How much medical information are they getting? What is their level of involvement in decision making, which I think can be especially relevant in sort of my space of pediatrics, and even, I would imagine, perhaps on the other end of the spectrum too, in geriatrics. I thought this might be a nice time to pause and just ask, either you can chat or unmute, or maybe just think to yourself if that feels better. Just wondering if anyone has sort of reflections on this slide, on experiences with death anxiety in patients or self. Like I shared, the sort of pursuing work that deals with death line really kind of was a source of a lot of self-reflection for me. So I wonder if anyone has thoughts or feelings about that. Something that I was thinking about, and in sort of talking about this talk with Paula, she sort of similarly thought about, is like, what are some of the factors that influence death anxiety? So one of the things is sort of course, the society in which you live and the culture in which you live. And we really think about, in terms of death anxiety, societies that are on a spectrum from death affirming to death like denying or death avoiding. And I think, like, as an example, perhaps it's safe to say that the US is a bit more of a death avoiding or death denying society. We think of sort of all these images of like fighting illness or death as the enemy, all these things that perhaps imply that death then is a failure to like beat or overcome something. And in fact, there have been studies that have shown that people from more Western cultural viewpoints experience higher levels of death anxiety. And perhaps one of the reasons for that, or a contributing factor, is that sort of over time we have been like really distanced from death and all of the things that surround death. So way back when, death may have occurred like in a home or within a community, and so did all of the like subsequent things that happened after death, the sort of cleansing of the body, the funerary ritual, the burial ritual, all of that stuff happened within a home or within a community, really sort of accessible and close to somebody. And over time, with sort of the Civil War was in there, so embalming practices became a thing. And sort of as funeral homes popped up, as medical technology advanced, death and serious illness really was removed from the home and distanced from people who were generally well and able to stay at home. And that might have contributed to sort of this feeling that death is a black box, like I mentioned, I felt earlier. So kind of interesting. And similarly, there have been studies about the relationship of like religiousness, personal like faith and religion, and levels of death anxiety. And it looks like mixed findings around religiousness itself, like identifying as someone with a religion, like sort of religious practice. But what there does seem to be a relationship with is lower levels of death anxiety in people who have a belief in a rewarding afterlife. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Paula, hi.
I just wanted to flag you to a comment from Tim in the chat that just says, really appreciate the talk. I have just started reading more about care management theory and the writings of Ernest Becker. I've been drawn to hospice work myself to ease some of my own anxiety around death, to learn from those who are doing it.
Thanks for sharing that. I will save those names. I'm excited to look into and read sort of in parallel to you, all of those things. But thank you for that comment. I really appreciate it. Okay, thinking about death anxiety and suffering, specifically in pediatric palliative care, is sort of the work that I'm citing in this slide, but I think that there are concepts that can be extrapolated to adult medicine too. So interestingly, when not addressed or poorly managed, anxiety around death and death anxiety can be really thought of by parents of children who have died as one of the most distressing symptoms of suffering that they see in their children. And it has been shown to cause more complicated grief after children's death for the parents. I think thinking about what is the relationship of physical symptoms that may contribute to bodily sensations associated with anxiety that then might exacerbate existing death anxiety or worries around death. For example, I feel like an easy one is dyspnea. Dyspnea, like itself, kind of triggers your fight or flight, or like your sympathetic response, and that can really trigger your anxious thoughts. So just, of course, making sure that those symptoms are addressed, and also considering secondary effects of medications being used to treat other symptoms. So for example, steroids at the end of life, like might that be contributing to somebody's anxiety around death? One way to think about addressing these things, or at least preparing families for them, is just anticipatory guidance around death. Of course, working with a family to understand what it is they would like to know and what it is they would like their child to know. But especially, I think, for adolescents and young adult, it may help alleviate some aspects of death anxiety. So one of the articles I cite here is from Texas Children's, and they talk about a young woman who has end-stage cystic fibrosis who just had so much anxiety around her own death as her sort of illness progressed. She really felt like she was going to die of an acute medical event. And so she was having a really hard time leaving the house or really leaving like the sight of her mom. And so they sort of went through some anticipatory guidance and some other things working with her through that, and shared with her, might it be helpful for us to share how we might expect you to die based on your disease? And she was open to that, and it sort of helped her live the remaining days of her life in a way that she was more hopeful to, rather than sort of colored by all the fears and worries she had about the way that she would die. I think actively involving kids in legacy building and memory making, that is something that can help with anxiety, specifically around like how might their loved ones cope after death. I think some kids worry a lot about how will my siblings be, will my parents be okay? And as I said, I think there are many adults who think of the same thing. Will my children be okay? Might my parents, how might my parents navigate this? And legacy work gives some control back to either the child or the adult who is dying, and allows them an opportunity to sort of create things as they hope to be remembered, sort of have some control over the narrative of their life and their death, and also feel like they're leaving their loved one with something to remember their relationship. And that can be really powerful. And then something I found really interesting is, of course, caregivers and parents are humans too, and so have their own relationship with death outside of their child who might be dying. So caregivers who have higher levels of death anxiety themselves are more likely to not want to talk about death with their child, and more likely to use euphemisms, which can be certainly for children and also for adults really confusing when you're talking about death. So just thinking about death anxiety, not only in the person who is dying, but in all the people that are around them who might be having conversations about life and death with their loved one. This is a sort of anthropological concept around like reactions to death anxiety and fear of death. But so Lifton and Olson have this theory of symbolic immortality, and it basically posits that people explore modes of immortality in order to overcome their own innate death anxiety and allow themselves to live a life that feels meaningful and will sort of promise them continuity with other people. So it's one way that people cope with perhaps their anxiety around death and allow themselves to continue to live their life without feeling paralyzed by that fear or anxiety. So I won't go through all of them, but there are these 5 ways that people might seek a sense of immortality. I think they sort of relate back to legacy building. It all kind of comes back to having some control over the narrative of like your life and who you were, and wanting to feel remembered or present in life. Something that many different people from many different places in the world have practiced as one way to combat anxiety and fears around death is death awareness, or mindfulness of death in life. There are sort of 2 big bucket examples that I thought were really nice and wanted to share. But in general, death awareness is thought, again, been practiced for like many years. And it's just thought to sort of bring death to the forefront of your consciousness in hopes of aligning your life with your values. And it's thought to cultivate sort of meaning and focus in life, because you have awareness that there is impermanence in life, and that you are sort of on this in whatever lived experience you're in for a limited time, and then things change. The other thing it's thought to do is really help ameliorate death anxiety and fear of death, and again, help just sort of accept that life is impermanent. So Maranasati is sort of a spectrum of practices, and I just have two sort of examples from what I understand to be each end of the spectrum. It's a Buddhist practice, and sort of one of the more basic ends of the spectrum is prayer and reciting prayer. So the five remembrances seem to be the most common and most sort of like talked about in the Googleable world. But this is a translation that is pretty commonly used of the five remembrances, and they basically center around life's impermanence and the body's impermanence, and sort of the nature of the body and the person to grow old as everybody does, and to have ill health as everybody does, and eventually to die, and how things are always changing. The sort of other end of the spectrum, which would be then the more sort of like involved end of the spectrum, is charnel ground contemplation. And it seems, based on my understanding, that this is mostly practiced by religious figures, and in general, mostly Buddhist monks. And the hope or the idea is similar, to gain a closer sense of one's mortality. Charnel grounds are places where bodies are put to decay sort of out in open air. And so the monks will visit these grounds and sort of recite their contemplation or their prayer. And this is just one translation, an example of one translation. There are similar practices in Christianity of sort of bringing death to the forefront of consciousness. I chose to share this one because there was a recent New York Times article about it in the last year about this nun who lives, I think, in the Midwest, who is trying to bring back this practice, this ancient practice called memento mori, which is literally translated from Latin to mean remember your death. And so they basically use symbols to just sort of be mindful that death will happen. And the most common symbol, as you can imagine, is a skull. So there she is with her, one of her many skulls. She has, interestingly, if you're interested in learning more about her, a presence on Twitter, and her Order of Nuns is really active on TikTok, which I've not seen, but they referenced in the article. So if you have more curiosity around that, she shares her sort of reflections or devotions around death daily, apparently, on her Twitter. So sort of moving toward, I guess that was the piece of perspectives around death, and sort of moving toward what are the rituals and how do the perspectives inform the rituals. Just zooming out again to think about what is ritual in terms of loss, and grief ritual in particular is thought to have three main phases. So disruption, transformation, and repatterning. And disruption is sort of the event that shakes everything up. It's the thing that it's the loss. And that's the moment where we sort of leave our everyday reality behind and enter what is to be a ritual space. Transformation, the second sort of stage or process, is the thing that sort of happens when we're beginning to or willing to start to rearrange our relationship with what or whom we have lost. And then repatterning is what happens sort of toward the end of and after the ritual, as we make sense of the ritual experience and sort of return to everyday life. Again, most of this is sort of ritual in relation to loss and grief and mourning. And so some of the benefits of ritual, of course, there are many, but certainly in the context of loss, is that it allows people to act and sort of gives them the space and time for grief. Also validates the loss and sort of allows for some control over the loss, or some control over the separation that they're feeling from the loved one or whatever it is that they lost. It also provides just a little bit of structure, and perhaps a lot of ritual involves like a ritual object. And so perhaps a way to, as you get further and further from the loss, through your ritual object, continue to connect with the time and space in which the loss was most prevalent. Of course, there are like more traditional or formal ritual, and then also there's personal ritual. And interestingly, ritual studies scholars are sort of noting a trend of an like more personal ritual coming to the forefront. So whereas like formalized or traditional ritual used to sort of be how people marked a loss, often affiliated with like religious traditions, there is a thought that those are perhaps not meeting people's specific needs, or allowing for like full emotional expression or sense making on a personal level of what someone is going through. So there is a trend towards sort of more personal ritual outside of the more traditional or religious space. And then rituals can be really powerful because of their liminal nature. And liminal is a Latin word meaning threshold, and really sort of describes encounters that are sort of almost giving somebody a feeling of sacredness, or like close to the unknown or sort of unconscious. People talk about liminal events as like somebody's death or even somebody's birth. When like a big crisis strikes, like those events feel liminal, and liminality can be a really important concept in the transformative nature of rituals. One way to think about formal and traditional rituals, especially, but even personal rituals, dates back to the early to mid 1900s. Van Gennep is a French ethnographer and folklorist who thought about rituals at every phase of life. So this is a quote from him, and it's just that in life, we go through a series of passages from one thing to another, and death is just one of those passages. So he thinks about these like quote unquote elevation rituals, which are really like funerary or mortuary rituals, as happening in 3 different phases, which might look a little bit familiar to sort of what we talked about: disruption, transformation, and repatterning. And I think this may have sort of been the foundation laying for that eventual theory, but preliminary phase is thought of as the disruption or the rite of separation that isolates the person or the thing that was lost and the person who has lost the thing or the person. There's the liminal phase, so that marks sort of for the deceased person, that marks their passage from the land of the living to whatever is the afterworld. And this is the phase that's sort of specifically known for the meat of the ritual, or like the more elaborate ritual, perhaps the funeral or whatever it is. And then the post-liminal phase, he calls the rite of incorporation, or like we just talked about on the previous slide, repatterning. So that indicates sort of that final passage of the soul to the world of the dead, and the return of the mourners to society. So sort of like marks the end of the ritual and sort of the re-engaging with society and life with this new relationship to whomever is lost. That was sort of one way to think about sort of formalized ritual. And then there is this other way to think about it, which is actually rooted in an architectural framework. There is an architect who was previously at the University of Michigan, who worked in a studio that was basically called the Ritual Landscape Studio. And they looked at how does death interact with all of the components involved in death, dying, and ritual. And I just loved the framework, so I wanted to share it. It helped me sort of make sense of all of the things, or many of the things, that are in relationship to this experience that we all have, which is death and dying. So these are sort of her 4 components of what is involved in death ritual, it's the body, the family, or the loved ones, the public, and the ritual landscape. So we'll go through each. We can do briefly. So the body really includes all of the sort of practice and processes that are involved in preparing, displaying, disposing of the body, and are generally sort of demonstrative of what is the relationship of the body to the soul and the life to the afterlife. So it might involve specific ways of cleansing or dressing the body. For example, there is a Thai tradition in which bodies of deceased loved ones are wrapped in white cloth, and then 3 strings are placed around the body, and those strings are meant to demonstrate or meant to represent like worldly worries. So there's a string around the neck to symbolize descendants, a string around the hands to symbolize a spouse or partner, and a string around the feet to symbolize assets and money. And in order for the soul to be released after death, those strings need to be cut, and they're done so before cremation. So just an example of how there may be specific manners of cleansing and dressing the body after death in these rituals after death. Direction and orientation of the body may be consequential as well. So there are a number of practices in which the body needs to be oriented in a specific way, perhaps before cremation, and in a specific way after cremation, or throughout the burial process. And then location and timing of burial can be really consequential for families. I thought a nice example that feels really relevant and definitely comes up sort of in our community of practice is that in Islam, it's really important for burials to occur quite shortly after death, and that even shorter after death than the process of some of the funeral homes in the US and some of the cemeteries in the US. And so that is sort of another space of potential conflict that may not best be serving the families or the people who are dying, who this is really consequential for. And then because we practice in here in the US, I just thought I'd mention what we probably all know, which is that the most common practices of what to do with the body after someone has died is cremation and then embalming with conventional burial. And there are a lot of alternative practices on the rise, which we won't totally get into, but can include like body composting or water cremation, green or natural burials. And these sort of alternative practices are thought to be people's sort of hope for their death and burial to be reflective of their values or their belief systems, whereas previously like embalming and traditional burial or cremation might have been reflective of a religious belief system for some. People are now sort of honoring other belief systems in their lives. For example, a desire to be clean and green with their death and burial. I think notably in the body, we can also sort of think about the bodies of the living, of the loved ones of the people who have died. There are, in a lot of cases, certain expectations of those people. So like wearing black or white or a certain color or a certain thing to symbolize mourning, or at funerals is just one example. Okay, the second component is the family. I added the loved ones because I felt like the family was a little bit, some people have loved ones who aren't necessarily family. So what fits in the family category is just familial mourning practices and then how people experience or express grief. So there is obviously a wide variety and spectrum of familial mourning practices. Again, like attire, also how might somebody interact with a community or sort of participate in community activities after the death of their loved one. And then there are also like a set of rituals that can happen before death, like around the end of life, at the time of death. And one of those is holding vigil, but also feasting and dancing, drinking, sort of offering practices, things of that nature, that I thought were worth a mention here. And then how do people experience grief, especially family and loved ones who have lost things? There are obviously a spectrum of emotions associated with grief reactions. There are a number of models associated with grief as well. I think the Kubler-Ross model is the one that is the most well-known and sort of the most referenced in the mainstream world. I talked with Paul last week about how we both heard a story on KUOW of, it was about like how people in the workplace are dealing with generative AI, which is now in the workplace. And the person talking about that referenced the Kubler-Ross model in terms of how people were currently in denial and needed to get to acceptance. Interestingly, that sort of in the like grief research world, the model of Kubler-Ross, while really important in sort of bringing to the forefront these conversations, has been criticized for a number of reasons. And I think helps to know the background that the original work was really based on interviews of people who themselves were dying and was thinking more about anticipatory grief in those who were facing the end of their own life. And then sort of later down the line was reapplied to include many types of grief. So I think that's one of the criticisms of it, is that there may not be sufficient evidence, or it may not be validated enough to this sort of other group of grieving people that it's been traditionally applied to, and this other type of grief that it's been traditionally applied to, and that perhaps in general, no matter its application, that it might be applied to rigidly or linearly. Like, you know, you don't necessarily, basically grief looks different for everybody, and you don't necessarily go through these sort of stages in a linear fashion. So lots of alternative and subsequent models of grief have come up, a few of which are mentioned here, and they include a variety of things. So some of the models discuss grieving in nonlinear phases. So there's still sort of like tasks or phases to go through, but not necessarily in any specific order. And then there are some models that just sort of abandon this idea that there's any like box to check off or any task or phase to get done, and really just think about grief as like a meaning-making process that should be fully experienced and supported through. Okay, almost done. So the public is sort of broken up into two, in this framework, into two groups. And one is collective mourners and one is institutions that interact with death. So the public collective mourners, originally I thought, like, are we just arbitrarily differentiating here, like the loved ones and then the greater body of people who are mourning whatever loss? But I sort of see in this effort to say there is like the family, the people who are like immediately bereaved, and then there is this sort of public or social entity of community who are personally touched by the loss and may sort of show up to whatever funerary ritual there is out of respect for either the person who has died or their loved ones. I sort of understood the wanting to differentiate those things. So we're rolling with it and differentiating the sort of collective mourner group from the immediate family group. That being said, I think like just because somebody would be designated in a loved one or family group versus a sort of greater mourning group doesn't have any implication about like their level of grief or how much they should grieve. It's not that, you know, family necessarily will have a different or more intense grieving experience than perhaps somebody who is not in that immediate circle. So just to make sure I've said that. And then the institutions that interact with death, We mentioned them a little bit before in the talk, but it's everyone who is sort of thought of as behind the scenes for death and death ritual, and sort of turn it into an event or I guess an event. So we think of things like hospitals, cemeteries, funeral homes, florists, musicians, groundskeepers. There's like, the list can go on. And I just think important to remember that access to and presence of these institutions and their level of involvement in someone's death and the rituals surrounding death will, of course, depend on who you are and where you're from, and sort of what is the framework in which you live. The last thing about the public is really just like the funeral ritual itself, which is thought to have sort of 3 interconnected functions, which are to like physically get the body to their final resting place, to transition the person who has died out of the living world and potentially into the next. And then the third thing, as we've been alluding to and talking about, is to allow the bereaved to work through their grief and guilt. Paula.
Just bringing your attention to a great comment from Erica about, I'll just read it. Great public grief space, the resting place in Seattle was written about in the Seattle Times last week, centers the grief experiences of Filipino and people of color. And she put the link in and just notes that was started by the founder works for Journey, Journey is the bereavement program for Seattle children. So just wanted to highlight that as you're talking about public grief spaces.
Thank you. And
Thanks, Erica.
Did you want to say something? Oh, thanks, Erica. You said, okay. That sort of perfectly segues into the final sort of component of how death might interact with aspects of ritual, which is like the ritual landscape itself. And I think this is where the influences of like architectural influences come in, but really thinking about like, what is the space of death? And what is the space or like literal landscape that death and death rituals are played out? And then how might death sort of interact with that space? So interestingly, you can think about like social values as something that might come to the forefront when you look, even when you just like look at a death landscape. So like perhaps a cemetery. So you might see like social values of wealth and status in plots that might be more sort of quote unquote valuable, or depending on their real estate value. You might see it in what the grave markers look like. Is it a standing monument? Is it a flat tombstone? Is it permanent or not permanent? And then also by like sort of how bodies are physically transported to the cemetery. All of these things can be signifiers of social values of wealth or family. Some people like to be, it's important to some people to be buried or laid to rest sort of in their family unit in a certain space. Religion can also come into play. There are, for example, Catholic cemeteries, and that can sort of be somebody's way to demonstrate their sort of connection with their Catholic faith. So some really interesting stuff to think about. And then this specific project, the ritual landscape, was again at the University of Michigan, and so done in Detroit. And so they did a lot of thinking about cemeteries as the site of both funerary rituals and a resting place for the dead, and also a site of recreation and leisure, as many urban cemeteries are also like city parks. Or I came from LA, and so in LA there's well, there are many cemeteries, but one cemetery in particular, the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, is really thought of as a like social gathering place. There are like outdoor movie screenings there in the summer. People host like craft fairs there. It's really like a gathering place for many people in the city who are not actively interacting with death or the death of a loved one, but sort of use death space or the cemetery space as a community or gathering space. So just something that is I found really interesting to think about. And then really just to wrap up, I leave you with this quote from Gretchen Wilkins, who is the architect who is sort of behind the ritual landscape framework, and really hope that this talk was helpful and somehow resonated with you on any level. I'm hopeful you'll continue to think about like how death interacts with all the spaces and people that it might touch, and how we are all sort of informed by our lived experience and our identities when we think about decision making and life and death and all those things. So yeah, I would open it up for questions or thoughts or feelings, whatever you'd like to share. I would love to hear. And Shanitra told me to put this up, and I always do what Shanitra says. So there we go. Oh, can you see that still?
No, it went away. There you go. It's back.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Alexa, is it okay? I don't have a question, but I just want to thank you for such a wonderful talk that I feel like is almost meditative this morning and really centering in a way that I don't know, but personally, I really needed at this time in the year where we are in the palliative program at children. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Kimmy. I appreciate that. I'm going to take this down so that we can see each other. Is that okay?
Erica has her hand up.
Oh, please.
This was really just, I agree with everything that Kimmy said. This was just such an amazing talk this morning, Alexa, and just thinking about, changing of the seasons is often a difficult time for folks who are living in grief, which is also a universal experience. One of the things that I was thinking about during this talk is for us in academia, I think one of the things that can help us be more culturally responsive in death work is not only looking at scholarly work, but looking at community work, right? And a couple of resources that I personally utilize in death work that I'm involved in is one of them is called the Collective for Radical Death Studies. And it's a collaborative of funeral directors, scholars, death doulas, and many others who contribute to that. And then the other is really looking for readings such as like Tim put in the chat earlier, but also there's a book called The End is Just the Beginning, and it's Lessons in Grieving for African Americans. Right, because like I think about even within my own family, the way that we acknowledge grief and loss and death. I mean, in some ways it's this is going to sound odd, but in some ways it's celebratory. And thinking about, for team members who attended my father's funeral 5.5 years ago, it was a celebration, right? And so being open to that, also being open to the way that people grieve differently within the hospital space. I think about security being called on a mother who is keening loudly on the floor, and and I've heard after her child has died or after her her spouse has died or whatever. And I've heard this multiple times kind of across colleagues across the country about like, oh my gosh, security was called on this grieving A, B, C, or D. And so even our systems aren't set up to be culturally responsive for how people actually grieve in the moment. So again, thank you. This was such an amazing way to start the day today.
Well, thank you so much for those insights and those resources, which I am hopeful definitely to dig into, and also for your really thoughtful reflection on, the many ways our systems can honestly like fail us and our patients, and in times of real tenderness, in times of grief, and not recognizing that there are many, many ways that that can look. So I appreciate that a lot. Thank you. We have a couple more minutes. And so I will remain on and encourage anybody's thoughts and perspectives, and certainly welcome them, and I'm very grateful for them, and also recognize that we're nearing 9 o'clock, and so okay to go if we need to do that as well. I see one more comment. Oh, thank you. Yes, worth mentioning the value of support groups, which really helped a partner as they were approaching their own death, and helped with grieving as well. Yeah, such an isolating experience. Death and surviving a loved one can be so helpful to have proximity with others who are in that fraught space as well. Yeah, thank you so much for that comment. It's a great point. Thank you all for sharing and for joining this morning.
Great job. Thank you, Alexa.
Thanks. Oh, thank you, Luke. Ronit Elks, wonderful work around partnering. Thank you. I need to save all of these.
That was great, Alexa. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks.